Welcome back to the channel if you've been here before, and hello if you're new. Today is part 2 of my crochet pixel grid tutorials. In this video, we're going to cover one free software program with which you can create your own custom crochet pixel grids completely from scratch. So I'll show you how to do that from start to finish. Originally, I did intend for this video to cover a lot more information than that. However, having made the tutorial sections already, they have both run a lot longer than I thought they would. So instead, I'm going to be breaking this video down into multiple parts. Today, we are just covering the desktop PC version, but in the follow-up video, which should be out in roughly 2 weeks, I will be covering an app on Android with which you can do the same thing. So you can create your very own custom crochet pixel grids. Apologies to Apple users, but I do not have any Apple products. No, wait, that's a lie. I have one very ancient iPod Nano that no longer works. But aside from that, I don't have any Apple products, so I cannot advise you on that. I will just be sticking with the Windows PC version and the Android app. Now, these tutorials have run long enough already, so let's not waste any more time and get straight into it. Alrighty, we're going to start off here today with the Inkscape tutorial. The first thing you want to do is head over to the Inkscape website, and I'll pop a link for that down in the description, but it's just inkscape.org. So once you head on over there, you should be met with this page here. And the next thing we want to do is download Inkscape. So you can do that by either clicking download now, or just head on up here, download current stable version. Next step is just going to be to download and install Inkscape. So take a moment and do that. Once you've downloaded and installed Inkscape, we're just going to open it up. So let's do that now. Open up Inkscape, and you should be met with this screen here. Now, this is where we can set up our canvas. And to do that, I'm going to head down to social, which is on the left-hand side here. And I am going to select, where is it? Let's scroll on down. Instagram Square, which is 1080p by 1080p. I like to go with this size. I tend to use it most frequently just because the grids I make tend to be squares. If you're making a rectangle, for example, you can go with a different size. For, let's see, what have we got down here? So there's a 1080 by 920. That will give you a good rectangle shape. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to go with the Instagram Square 1080 by 1080. So we're just going to select that, and that'll load on up. And when you first open Inkscape, it can be very overwhelming. There is a lot going on. And if you've never used a program like this before, you're just bombarded with all the options. But don't freak out. We are going to take this slowly. The first thing that we're going to do is make ourselves one singular box. And it's from this singular box that we're going to build our entire grid. To make that box, we'll head on over to the left-hand side here and select the rectangle tool. Or you can press R on your keyboard as the shortcut. So we're going to select that. Then we're going to come back over to our canvas and we're going to make our square. Now, if I just click and start dragging, you can see I get all sorts of weird and wonderful rectangle shapes. And as wonderful as they are, that's not what I want. I want a square. Control Z that away. I'm going to click, but I'm also going to hold down Control on my keyboard as I drag. What this does is it maintains the aspect ratio. So you can see now I just have a square. So I've got a square and I'm holding Control down, and that is maintaining that shape. That's what we want. So you're just going to click and drag out until you have a square. At this stage, it doesn't matter what size this square is because we're going to adjust it later anyway. So we're going to click and drag, and that is our square created. The next problem that we need to tackle is the coloring. We don't want a solid color square. As you can see here, mine is just completely black. That's not going to help us later on if we want to design our own pattern on the grid. What we want to do is give this a stroke around the outside, and we want the fill to be clear. To do that, first let us get rid of the rectangle tool. So we're going to head back over to the left-hand side for now. We're going to select the select tool, which is the top one, the arrow here. And again, if you prefer keyboard shortcuts, you can just press S on your keyboard. We are then going to head down to the bottom left-hand corner, right down here, and you should be able to see 3 squares. You've got one that's got this X through it. We've got another here that is black with a little sort of eye symbol in it, and then we've got a white square. We want to click on the crossed out white square, so the first one in the row here, and that is going to get rid of our fill. Now you might be wondering, well, hang on, my square's gone invisible, but don't worry, we're going to fix that now. We're going to add a stroke to this. So if you go up to the top where you've got File, Edit, View, Layer, etc., etc., we are going to head to Object, click Object, go down to and select Fill and Stroke. Clicking that has added a panel over on the right hand side here. So if we head on over to the right hand side, you should see one says Layers and Objects. This is where all our squares that we're going to create will be. They will be our layers. But the one we've just added is Fill and Stroke. We're going to click on that if it's not already selected. And just beneath that title, Fill and Stroke, you can see we've got Fill, Stroke Paint, and Stroke Style. We want to head into Stroke Style, so I'm going to click that, and it'll present us with all these options. The width is the size of your stroke, so if I change that to 30, you can see I've got a really thick border around my square now. I can change that to 15. It's a bit thinner, and I could really go all out and put it up to 100, and that increases it much, much more. I tend to go for a 2 or a 3 for the stroke for my squares, but this is something that you will have to play around with, because depending on the total number of squares you have in your final grid, you may find it more advantageous to have a thicker stroke. You may find it more advantageous to have a thinner stroke. So that is something you can just play around with. But for now, I'm going to stick with a stroke of 3. And that's all we need to do for the stroke. We are set. And now that we've finished that, we're going to head back into the Layers and Objects panel, which is the one right next to Fill and Stroke. I'm just going to click on that. And directly below that, this is all our layers. Now, our square at the moment is called Rect 1. Personally, I like to rename everything. This tends to avoid confusion further down the line. So I'm just going to rename this as 1, 0, 1. And to rename, you're just going to hover your mouse over the text of the layer, double click, and you should be able to rename it to whatever you want. So again, I'm calling this Square 1. Now that we've set up our first square, we are good to go to create the rest of the grid. We're going to begin the process by firstly making sure that we have our select tool selected. Again, press S on the keyboard as a shortcut. And now we're going to resize this square. How small or large you make this is again going to be dependent on the overall size of your finished grid. For this example, I'm going to be creating a 20 by 20 grid, but the same sort of techniques apply to any size grid that you want to make. So the first thing I want to do is make my square smaller. To do that, you can see all these arrows around the outside edge of the square. We are going to, again, making sure we've got our select tool on, we're going to click on one of the corner ones and pressing down Control on the keyboard so we maintain our aspect ratio like we did at the start when we first made our square. We're going to click and drag and make our square smaller. I'm going to go about this size, so hopefully you guys can still see what I'm doing. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier with the stroke. You can see my stroke went from this, from this, so that looks not super thick, but very clearly defined, to this, so a lot lighter. So if you would like your stroke to be a bit thicker when the square is smaller in your layers, make sure your square is selected. So we're going to click on that to select it, go back into Fill and Stroke, and then you can adjust it again like that. I may actually leave this thicker just so it's easier for you guys to see. So I'm going to leave it on 3, but that is how you adjust your stroke. Having resized our first square, we are now going to go on and make our second square. The easiest way to do that is to duplicate the first. That just saves us having to do the square creation, the fill and stroke, the resizing process over and over again. To resize your square, you're going to head on over to the Layers and Objects panel. Make sure your number 1 or whatever you renamed your square as, make sure that is highlighted just by clicking on it. And there's 2 ways you can duplicate it. You can right click on your square and go duplicate, so like this, just duplicate it. Or you can make sure your square is selected and use the keyboard shortcut of Control and D. Once you've done that, rename your second square. So I'm going to call this one 02. And just as a reminder to rename your layers, you're just going to hover over that layer and double click on the text. So double click like that. Now we have 2 squares. The process is underway. The next step is going to be to shift the second square to the right or the left, depending on which way you're working, of the first square. Make sure your second square layer is highlighted. So I've just clicked on number 2 here. Make sure that we've got our selection tool active. So click on the arrow, or again, press S on your keyboard. Then we're going to go down to our second square, which has all these arrows around it, indicating that we can, move it, transform it. We're going to click on the stroke so we can sort of grab it, pick it up, and then we're going to move it to the side of our first square. Now, we've run into another problem here, a little bit of a problem. My squares, as I move my mouse, I'm a bit unsteady, so my squares aren't really lining up. I want them to line up sort of perfectly. With a bit of finagling, you can do that freehand. It's not that difficult, but there is something we can do to make this entire process easier. So I'm just going to Control Z so my second square goes back to the original position. To fix this issue of having to freehand our squares, we're going to turn on snapping. And in order to do that, we want to head up to the top right-hand corner of our screen. And right up here, you can see 2 symbols. One is like a little magnet, and there is a left pointing arrow next to it. We are going to just click on the magnet, and that will turn on snapping. Make sure that you still have square 2 selected. So in your layers and objects panel, make sure square 2 is selected. We're going to head back down to it, pick it up and grab it. And this time, when we move it, you can see it's snapping to the first square. Now there are various snap points, as you can see. There you can snap it to the corner, but what we want to do is snap it to the side. So I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to pull my square to the right of the first until it snaps into position. You can sort of see it just snaps right on in there. And then we're going to drop it and leave it. And now that you've learned how to do that, you can basically make your own grid, because from here, the entire process is just duplicate. We're going to duplicate our row across on the horizontal until we reach the correct number of boxes or stitches in our row. And then we're going to duplicate the layers up vertically to create our rows. Once you get the basics down, it's really a simple process. For the next step though, we're going to highlight both of our squares. We're going to highlight the first square, so go head on over to the layers and objects panel. You want to select box 1. I've done that. Now you can hold down Control and then click on box 2, and that will select both of them, or you can select box 1, hold down Shift and select box 2. Control will select individual layers. Shift will select the first layer, the last layer, and all the layers in between those. But I'll show you that in practice more in a minute, because we've only got 2 layers at the moment. So with our 2 layers selected, both box 1 and box 2, we're going to duplicate those again. So right click and select duplicate, or press Control D on your keyboard. First thing we want to do is rename these as well. I'll be renaming this one box 3 and the second one box 4. And because they're on top of box 1 and box 2, we want to shift them as we did to box 2 earlier. So heading to your layers and objects panel, make sure that box 3 and box 4 are selected. We're not selecting box 1 and 2, just boxes 3 and 4. We want to make sure our selection tool is selected. That's never not going to sound ridiculous as I say it, but we're going to make sure that's selected. We're going to head on down to our boxes, click and grab, and then drag as we did before. So we're going to drag both of them over until box 3 snaps to box 2. And then we can let go of that. And now we have 4 boxes. What you can do now is keep duplicating all your boxes. So for example, I could select all 4 of my boxes, I could duplicate those and then shift them over, and that would give me, not like that, and that would give me 8 boxes in my row. But because I want 20 boxes in my finished grid, I want to work in multiples of 5. It just makes it a little bit easier to duplicate. So what I mean by that is I'll get rid of these ones I just duplicated. I'm going to now go up to box 4 in my layers and objects panel. So I'm going to select box 4, And I'm going to duplicate box 4. So I'm just duplicating one box. Control D or right click and press duplicate. First thing, rename this to box 5. Make sure it's selected, and then I'm going to shift that over. There we go. But now I have 5 boxes, and this is going to make it a little bit easier for me to get to my 20. So I want to select all 5 boxes in my layers and objects panel. I'm going to select box 1. I'm going to hold down shift on my keyboard, and then I'm going to select box 5. And you can see how doing this, it selects all of the layers or the boxes in between. Now that they're all selected, we again want to make sure we still have our select tool active, and we've got the little arrows around our boxes. We are then going to duplicate all 5 layers, so Control D or right click and duplicate. Once more, I'm going to take the time to rename all of this, so I want to change the names to 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And now I want to select the last 5 boxes, the 5 that I just duplicated. So that's going to be box 6 to box 10. Select box 6 in your layers and objects panel, hold down shift, and then click on 10. So now we have those final 5 boxes selected. Once again, just check you got your selection tool active. We're going to click, we're going to drag all 5 boxes across. And now if you'll snap in place, there we go. And now we have 10 boxes in our row. Again, I want 20. So this time I am going to select all 10 boxes. I am clicking on box 1 in my layers and objects panel. I am then holding down shift, going up to box 10 and selecting that again. And now you can see all of my boxes are highlighted. They are all selected. We want to duplicate again, Control D or right click and duplicate. Rename. And yes, this process can be tedious, but trust me, it can help you out in the long run. So it's worth spending the time to do. So that is all of my boxes. Now, if I select the final 10 boxes, the ones that I just duplicated, and move them across, they are going to spill off my canvas here, this white square. To prevent that, we want to shrink down all of our boxes. So I need to highlight all 20 layers or all 20 boxes. Start at box 1, I'm going to select that, hold down shift, and then I'm going to click on box 20, my last box, and that will select everything in between. We are then going to, again, make sure our selection tool is active. We're going to click on one of the corner arrows, so you can choose whichever corner, it doesn't really matter. So this one, this one, this one, or this one, but click on that. Hold down Control on your keyboard to maintain that aspect ratio, and we're just going to shrink our boxes. If you accidentally shrink your boxes too far down, that's okay. We can come back later and resize them. So it doesn't matter if they're a little bit too small at this point, but once we've resized those 10, we want to go back to our layers and objects panel and select the final 10 that we duplicated. So that was square 11 to square 20. Again, select square 11 first. We're going to hold shift, and then we're going to select box 20. We're going to shift those across as we've done before. So grab them and start dragging them across until the first box snaps with the last box. Snap please. There we go. And that's our first row complete. If you would like to continue on this process, so for example, if you wanted to add 40 boxes to your grid, you would select all 20, duplicate those again, and then shift the last 20 across, replicating what we just did. That will give you 40, and you can continue on and make this grid as large as you like. Once you have reached that point, so you have all the boxes in your row that you need, we are now going to repeat this process, but on the vertical to give us our rows. The first step to that process is going to be to group up all of these boxes. You don't necessarily have to do this, but I like to because it just keeps things nice and neat, and you can find where everything is at a glance. So we're going to highlight all our boxes. So however many you made, we're going to start at the first one. So for me, that is box 1. We're going to go all the way up to the last one, hold down shift and select that. Again, for me, that is box 20. And then we're going to press Control G on our keyboard to group them together. So you can see under where it says layer 1 here, I've got a folder that says G20. I'm just going to rename that to row 1. If you look to the right of row 1 here, you can see these little symbols. So you can lock the layer and you can turn the layer invisible or not. So if I click the eye, that will make the layer invisible, and you can see all my boxes disappear. So they're sort of all linked at the moment. They're all in the same folder. I want to turn that back on so you can see what I'm doing. But now that we have row 1, we're going to make row 2. And we're going to do this in exactly the same way as we replicated our boxes. Right click on row 1 and select duplicate, or you can highlight it and press Ctrl D on the keyboard. And now we have 2 rows. I'm going to rename the second one to row 2. Make sure it's highlighted. Selection tool is active. And this time we're going to click and drag, but instead of dragging across, we're going to drag up. So I'm going to click, drag, and pull my layer up. And if you've got snapping on, that should just snap right into place. And now we have 2 rows. I'm just going to shift mine down a little bit because I think I'm going to run out of room up here. So I'm making sure both are selected. I'm just going to click and drag you guys down here. But now that we have 2 rows, it's easy enough to make 4. So we want to make sure that both of our rows are selected. We've selected row 1 and row 2. We're going to press Ctrl D or right click and duplicate. Rename your rows, row 3 and row 4. Make sure rows 3 and 4 are selected. So press on row 4 or row 3, hold Control and select the second one. We're then going to go down to our squares, click, drag up, and make sure those snap into place. And now we have 4 rows. Like I did with the squares, I want to be working in multiples of 5. So for this next row, I'm just going to duplicate my last one, which was row 4. Make sure row 4 is selected in your Layers and Objects panel. Control D on the keyboard, or again, right click and select duplicate. I will rename that to row 5. Make sure it's selected, and then I'm going to click and drag up. With 5 rows, I'm going to duplicate them all to give me 10. Make sure all your row folders are selected. Click on row 1 so it's highlighted. Now, for some reason, I can never get my folders to work by holding Shift, so I can't select them all at once. So I'm just going to hold Control, and then click on all of my rows. So I'm just going to make sure they're all highlighted, all selected. We're then going to duplicate those 5 rows, Control D. Once more, we're going to rename everything. Very tedious, but pretty necessary. 8, 9, and 10. Then make sure that the 5 rows you just duplicated are selected. So we want 10, 9, 8, 7, and 6 to be highlighted. We're then going to click, drag, and place those 5 rows on top of our previous 5. So now we have 10 rows for our grid. I'm going to duplicate these one more time to give me my 20. So for that, I want to highlight all 10 rows. I'm starting at row 1, holding down Control and just clicking my way up. So everything is now selected. I'm going to duplicate those, Control and D. And now I have to rename all these. And 20. Then I just have to move those 10 rows. So I want to select row 20 all the way down to row 11. Once more, I'm just holding Control and clicking on each row individually, making sure my selection tool is active. I will click on my squares, drag them up until they snap. And that gives me my 20 by 20 grid. Like I mentioned with the squares, if you want to keep repeating this process, so if you want 40 rows, you're going to highlight all 20 rows that you already have, duplicate those, click and drag, make sure you rename them too, and just keep repeating that for as many rows as you would like. But I am going to stop there. I have my 20 by 20 rows. If you would like, you can finish up there and just leave it as a blank grid. But I'm going to take it a step further and I'm going to add some stitch and row counters to the outside. The first thing that I like to do though when I've finished a grid is head on over to the Layers and Objects panel again. I'm going to select all of my row folders. So far I've got 10 highlighted, but I want to make sure they're all highlighted and selected. And then I'm going to group up those as well. To do that, just press Ctrl G on your keyboard. And you can see they've condensed down into one folder. I'm going to rename this folder 20 by 20. And this step, it's not strictly necessary, you don't have to do this, but this makes it a whole lot easier just to move the entire grid. So if I highlight the 20 by 20 folder I've just made, my selection tool is active. If I click on my squares now, if I start to shift it, the whole grid will move. But if, for example, I'll open the folder, if I accidentally selected one individual row and I started shifting, that's only going to shift that row. And yes, it's easy to fix. You can just go back, especially with the snapping on, you just go back and put it, in place where it belongs. But it's just much easier to group all your rows together and move them all at once. There's no risk of one row accidentally shifting a little bit out of place. So that's why I like to group them all up at the end there. But I only do that once my entire grid is complete. So I've done my 20 by 20 grid, or I've done my 40 by 40 grid, or my 100 by 100 grid. When it's all done, that's when I group them together. Now that it's all grouped together, I'm going to shift this to sort of roughly the center of the canvas. And I want to make sure that I have room on the outside for my numbers. There's probably a little bit too much room here. You don't necessarily need this much. So if you'd like to make your squares, all your squares a little bit bigger, you're going to select your 20 by 20 or whatever size grid that you made. You're going to select that folder. Make sure your selection tool is active. You're going to click on one of the corner arrows. Hold down Shift to maintain the aspect ratio, and you can either shrink or enlarge your grid. Once you've resized your square, you've moved it into position, wherever that happens to be, we're now going to add some text to it. So we're going to create a stitch counter and a row counter. We're going to head on back over to the left-hand side here, and we want to select the text tool. The text tool is in the middle here. It's the A symbol. Just click on that. Then we're going to come back to our canvas, and I'm going to be starting in the bottom right hand corner down here. You can make a text box. To do that, you can click and drag, and any text you type will appear within this box. But for me, when I'm making a stitch counter or row counters, I just like to do these individually. It gives me a little bit more control over where I place each individual number. So we're going to get rid of those. I'll just delete the text layer. So we're going to select the text tool. We're going to come down here underneath the bottom right hand corner box here, and I'm just going to click, and then I'm going to type 1. If you want to edit your text, up the top here, you can change the font. So I'm just going to leave it as Calibri. I think it's Calibri. I tend to use that quite a bit. You can change the style, bold, italic, etc., etc. You can change the size. With the text, if it's looking a bit chunky, which mine is, I'll just make it bigger so you guys can see. It's looking a bit chunky. You may need to head into the fill and stroke panel that we were playing around with earlier on with our squares. So head on over here next to the layers and objects. We're going to first make sure that our text layer is highlighted. And while I think of it, we're going to rename this as well. And I'm going to rename that bottom 1. Once you've renamed your text, we're going to head into the fill and stroke panel. So let us head in there, click on fill and stroke. Now my number 1 has a stroke of 11. Now I don't want a stroke at all. So I'm going to change that to 0. And my number is going to disappear, because if you'll remember earlier when we made our first square, we turned off the fill, but now we want that back. So we've taken the stroke down to 0. You're going to then head on over to fill. So we've got stroke style selected. We want to make sure fill is selected. Just click on that. And then we're going to click this second box here. So we're going to click on that, and that will give us back our fill. That's all we need to do for our text. So I'm going to head back into the layers and objects panel. The first thing I really need to do is resize my one. It's a little bit large at the moment, and we do this the same way that we resized our squares. Make sure your selection tool is active. You want to click on one of the corner arrows, hit Control, hold down Control to maintain the aspect ratio, and I'm just going to make that smaller. I don't want to make it too small here because I want you guys to be able to see, but you can make this as small or as large as you like. Same thing with the squares. It's entirely up to you and what you want your grid to look like. So I'm going to stick one right underneath the first box here. And now that we've made our first number, it's really easy to make the second, the third, so on and so forth, because all we're going to be doing is duplicating the first. Again, like we made our squares, so I am going to duplicate the first text layer, make sure that's highlighted, so I'm highlighting bottom one, press either Control D on the keyboard or right click and duplicate. I'm going to rename this, but I'm going to rename this to 3. And the reason I'm renaming this to 3 is I like to have numbers on every second square. I tend to think it looks a little bit too crowded if I label every one. So I'm going to skip square 2 down the bottom here. I'm going to jump straight to square 3. I'm going to make sure square 3 is selected. I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to drag that under the third box. Even though we renamed this bottom 3 in the Layers and Objects panel, the text itself still says 1. We want to change that to 3, obviously. You can do that by either going over to your tools on the left-hand side here and selecting Text Tool, or you can just press T on your keyboard as a shortcut. Once you've done that, you can just change the text to 3. So I'm going to backspace, delete the 1, and add in a 3. If your number is no longer centered, you can fix that up. So just make sure that your bottom 3 text, or whatever you called it in the Layers and Objects panel, make sure that is highlighted and just move that across. Again, if you've got snapping on, it should snap. So there's 3. And now I'm just going to repeat the duplication process all over again. I'm going to select both bottom 1, hold down Control, select bottom 3. I'm going to press Control D to duplicate. I'm going to rename these 5 and 7. Once I've renamed them, I want to select the 2 that I've just duplicated, so that would be 7 and 5. I'm going to move those across. So I want to skip the 4th box, and what will be my 5 should be lined up with the 5th box. Like we did for stitch number 3, we need to change the text for stitch number 5 and stitch number 7. So either select your text tool or just press T on the keyboard. Then select bottom 5 or whatever you named it from the Layers and Objects panel. I'm going to click on there, backspace, and then 5. When I've changed the first, so I've changed it to 5, I then want to change the 7th one. I'm going to select bottom 7 from my Layers and Objects panel. I'm going to come down here, click on that, backspace, and change to 7. And my first 7 stitches are done. I want to repeat this process over and over until I reach the end of the row. So this time I'm going to highlight all 4 of my text. I'm going to highlight bottom 1, 3, 5, and 7, duplicate those, Control D, change their names so I know which ones they are. This time I'm going to go 9, 11, 13, and 15. Make sure they are all selected. So bottom 15, Control bottom 13, Control bottom 11, Control bottom 9. Our selection tool is active. Then we can click and drag those across. Again, I am skipping the square after stitch number 7, so I'm skipping this box here and I'm placing these, or the first one of these, in the second box from square 7. And these aren't perfectly centered at the moment, but as I explained before, you can go in and change their positioning. Next step is to change the text to match what it says in the Layers and Objects panel. So I'm making sure that I've got bottom 9 highlighted. I want the text tool, again, press T or select it from the menu over here. Click on the text if you need to, backspace to delete the one. I'm going to change that to 9, and then I'm just going to do the same for the next 3 squares. So I want to select 11, got my text tool active, click, backspace, change that. For 13, select that. Make sure my text tool is still active. Click, backspace and 13. And then finally 15, select, text tool is active. Click, backspace and 15. Now you can see that my double digit numbers, they've sort of shifted off center. So if you want to fix that, just highlight them by clicking on them. Make sure your selection tool is active this time. Then click and drag it so it's centered underneath the square. So I'm going to do the same for 13 now. Center that. And then for 11. Now because I have 20 boxes or stitches in my row, I'm only going to go up to 19 along the bottom here. So I've got 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, etc, etc. I've stopped at 15. I then want to do 17 and 19. Because I only need 2 more numbers, I'm only going to duplicate the last 2 layers. So I want to highlight my 15 and my 13 text layers, so only these final 2. I'm going to duplicate those, Control D, rename them, 17 and 19. I then want to make sure they're both highlighted, so I've selected 17, press Control, select 19, make sure my selection tool is active, and then I'm going to shift those across. Again, we're starting from the second square from the last one, so the second square from 15. Finally, we're going to change the text, make sure my 17 layer is active, then get the text tool by either clicking on it or pressing T on the keyboard, go down to where it says 13, click on that, and we're going to change that to 17. Make sure 19 is highlighted in your Layers and Objects panel. Make sure your text tool is selected. We're then going to click on our 15 and we're going to change that to 19. And with that, we've finished the text for our bottom layer here. So we've highlighted squares 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. As I said, I prefer this method just because it's less crowded. I don't like it when there's a whole bunch of numbers here. It's just a bit overwhelming for my brain. But if you would prefer, you can put a counter underneath each of the boxes. You will do the same process that we've just done here, except instead of having a number under every second box, you will have a number under every box. So it's the same thing, you're just not skipping a square. Now that we've made the bottom stitch counters, it's easy enough to make the top ones because we're just going to duplicate all of these. Once more, I'm going to put all of these in their own folder. Again, it's just a lot neater that way. So I am going to go back over to my Layers and Objects panel. I'm going to select number 1, so bottom 1 that I've called it. I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to select 19. So all of my text layers are selected now. Then I'm going to press Control G, and that will put them all into their own group. And I'm just going to call that bottom text. Not bottom text, bottom text. Okay, and now you can see that if I highlight that bottom text folder and I have my select tool active, I can move, if I grab hold of it properly, I can move all of those numbers at once. But I don't want to do that just yet because we need to duplicate it first. Again, making sure that your bottom text folder is selected, press Control D or duplicated. I'm now going to rename this to top text. Top text. Make sure that top text folder is highlighted. Make sure your selection tool is active, and then we're going to click, drag those numbers all the way to the top. You can leave this as is, but what I prefer to do is reverse the numbers, because when I'm working from right to left, as I would be with row 1 down the bottom here, the numbers are in the correct order. So the very first box down the bottom here, that would be stitch 1. However, when I'm working back in the opposite direction, so you chain 1, turn your work, and you work, say, from left to right in row 2, stitch number 1 is on this side over here, so it wouldn't be stitch 19. So I'm going to open up my top text folder. So you can see the top text folder here. To open it up, just click on the little arrow to the left of it here. Click on that. I'm going to select bottom 19. I want to get my text tool again. You can click on it over here or press T on your keyboard. and I'm going to change that text to say 1. For bottom 17, I want to select that. I'm going to make sure my text tool is still active. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to change that to 3. And I'm going to repeat this process all the way down until I've just reversed the numbers. So 13, I want to change that to 7. And then 19. Again, you don't have to do it this way. You can leave it as 1 to 19 from right to left, but because I know that I'm working from left to right, I like to have my numbers sort of represent that. So I'm just centering my numbers over their correct boxes. And 19. And what you can also do is go ahead and change the names of the text layers in your layers and objects panel. So bottom 1, which is highlighted currently, is actually stitch 19. So I can change that to 19, and then I change it, the one above that, to 17, and make my way down, so on and so forth. But just for the sake of time, I will skip that for now. With that done, we can close the top text folder. So again, just click on the little arrow to the left of the folder icon. Going to close that up, just a little, makes things a little bit neater. With the horizontals taken care of, our stitch counts, we are now going to add the row counters on the side. I like to have all of my odd rows on the right hand side because that's where I start working for my odd rows from right to left, and then I have all of my even rows on the left hand side because that's where I start working on my even rows from left to right. To start off the row counters, you can just reuse your text tool, so click on the A over to the left hand side here, the left hand side, or press T on your keyboard, but honestly I just prefer to duplicate the first number down here. To do that, if you go back into your bottom text folder, so we want to make sure that's highlighted, we want to expand the folder, click on the little arrow to the left of the folder icon, we're going to go down and find number 1, click on it to make sure it is highlighted, it is selected, and then we're just going to duplicate that, so Control D. Now we don't want this duplicated text to be in the bottom folder, so you're going to click and hold and we're going to drag it out of the folder. You can see as I pass the bottom text folder, it is highlighted in green. We don't want that because we don't want it in that bottom text folder. If I move it up further, the top text folder is highlighted. We don't want that either, so we want to push it up just a little bit further until we get a green line that is above the top text. So we don't want the box, the green box around the top text. We want the green line above it. And once you see that green line, you're just going to release, and we're going to drop that duplicated bottom 1 text there. When that's done, just close up both of these folders. So we're just clicking on the little arrows to the left of the folder icon again, close up the bottom text one, close up the top text one, and you can see our bottom one that we duplicated is still up the top here. First thing we need to do is move it. Head on over to the left, make sure that your select tool is selected, or press S on your keyboard. Then make sure that the bottom text 1, or whatever you happen to call it, that we just duplicated, make sure that is highlighted in your layers and objects panel. Once it is, we're going to click and drag it over so it is on the right hand side of the first box, like so. So we have 1 here and 1 here. So this becomes our first stitch of our first row. From here, the steps are basically the same as we did for the horizontal text, except we're working on the vertical this time. So I want to make sure that it's no longer bottom text. We want to rename that. I'm going to rename that right 1. Okay, I've renamed that right 1. I want to duplicate that, make sure it's highlighted, press Control D. I'm going to rename that to right 3. Then with right 3 highlighted and my selection tool active, I am going to click and drag. I'm going to pull that up to the 3rd row. So once more, I am skipping the 2nd row and I'm jumping up to row 3 because on this side, on the right hand side, I'm just going to have all of my odd rows labeled. Before we move on, we need to change the text of this second row. No, the third row. the second text layer we made, but the third row. So either click on the text tool or press T on your keyboard. We're going to click on what is a 1, and then we're going to change it to a 3. And then we're going to duplicate those. So we want to make sure that right 1 and right 3 are both highlighted. Duplicate, Control D. I'm going to rename those again. Right 5, right 7. This time I want to select the last 2 that we duplicated, so that would be right 5 and right 7. They're both highlighted. I'm going to make sure my selection tool is active. Click and drag. Once more, I'm skipping the row directly after 3. I want the second box from 3. And now that I've moved them, I want to change what the text says. So I'm going to press T to activate my text tool. Click on the 1, and I'm going to change that to a 5. And then I'm going to click on the 3 and change that to a 7. Now we can duplicate all 4 layers. Make sure right 1, right 3, right 5, and right 7 are all selected. Control D to duplicate. Rename. Select just those 4 layers we duplicated. So we're selecting 15, 13, 11, and 9. I want my selection tool active. Click, drag up. Again, we're skipping, or I'm skipping the box or the row straight after 7. I want to work in the second box from my 7th row. Put them in position, and then we're going to change what the text says. I'm pressing T to activate my text tool. I want to click on the 1. I'm going to change that to a 9. Click on the 3 to change it to an 11. Then a 5 to a 13, and the 7 to 15. Like I did with my horizontal rows, because I only have 2 boxes left to go, or 2 boxes that I want to label, I'm just going to select the last two text layers in my right column here. So I'm selecting right 15, holding Control and selecting right 13. I want to duplicate just those 2, Control D, and then I'm going to rename them. So I want 17 and 19. Make sure those final 2 are selected. So I'm selecting right 17 and right 19. Make sure my selection tool is active, so I can click on that or press S on the keyboard. Click, drag, and we're going to position those. Once more, we need to change the text itself. I'm going to hit T for my text tool, click on the 13 and change that to a 17, then click on the 15 and change it to a 19. And that's our right panel all finished. Like we did before, I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this tutorial, but it really is a lot of repetition. We are going to put these right text layers into their own folder. To do that, click on the top or the bottom one. It doesn't matter. I'm going to click on right 19 because it's already selected. We're going to go down to the last one, which is right, or technically the first one, which is right 1. Hold Shift and click on that. So all of the layers are selected. Then press Control G on your keyboard to put them into their own folder. And I'm going to rename this Right Text. And because we've done the right-hand side text, that's going to make it a little bit easier to do the left-hand side text, because all we need to do is duplicate this folder. So I'm going to highlight the right text folder. I'm going to either press Control D on the keyboard or right-click and press Duplicate. And that's going to give us a second right folder, which we will rename as Left Text. With the newly renamed Left Text folder highlighted, so I just want to click on that. I'm going to make sure my selection tool is active. And then I just want to click and drag all of my numbers from the right-hand side. I didn't want to do that. Make sure left is selected. We want to click on all the numbers and drag them from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. If we leave them where they are now, we are sort of labeling the same the same rows. So you can see row 19 on this side lines up with row 19 on the right hand side, row 11 lines up with row 11, row 1 lines up with row 1, and we don't want that. We want our left hand numbers to label the even rows, so row 2, 4, 6, etc, etc. All we need to do to fix this problem is to once again click and drag, and our first number 1 down the bottom here, should line up with the second square. So you can see I'm moving them up now, and we want to get that 1 to snap like this, snap to the second row. It's a little bit off, so I'm just going to move that down like so. And we can, like we've done before, we can go back into this left text folder and adjust the exact position of each of our individual text layers. We can do that in a minute, but the first thing we want to do is go into our left text box folder. Once more, we're just pressing the little arrow next to the folder icon, so I'm going to press that. I'm going to go right down to the bottom where it says right one, and I'm going to rename this to left 2. The one above it is going to be left 4, and I'm going to continue renaming all of these individual layers until I hit left 20. Now that all the individual layers are renamed, we want to change the text to match that. Again, I'm going to start down the bottom with left 2. I'm going to click on it to highlight it, to select it. Then I'm going to press T on my keyboard so my text tool is active. I'm going to go down to this number 1, which should be a 2, and I'm just going to change the text to say 2. I'm then going to jump up to number 3. I will click on that, erase it, and change it to 4. And just like that, I'm going to make my way up all of the numbers, jumping up by 2 each time. And that's all our text change. I was just going to leave the numbers where they were, but that's bothering me. So I need to center these a little bit better. To do that, you're just going to select the text layer that you want to move. I'm going to start with row 2 down the bottom. So I'm going to head on over to my layers and objects panel. I want to click on left 2, make sure my selection tool is active, and I'm just going to center you with the second box a little bit better. If you find the snapping to be annoying in this instance, for example, I want to snap number 2 to row 2, but it's not really letting me. It's trying to snap to the 4 above me here, and it's not going exactly where I want it. If you find that's the case, you can go up to the top right-hand corner here and turn off snapping where we turned it on before. So you can see my little magnet icon is highlighted. I'm just going to click that to deselect it. Now, if I come back to my 2 down here, I can move it freely now. It's not going to snap to everything around it. So I'm going to place that where I want it. So about there, that's all right. And because I would like the rest of my numbers to snap to that 2, so they'll be in a nice neat line, I'm going to go back to the top right-hand corner up here, and I'm going to turn snapping back on. So I'm just going to click on the magnet, turn that back on. I will head to my layers and objects panel, select 4, and then I can move that, and hopefully, there we go, that'll snap to both the box and the 2. Not quite. It's not going exactly where I want it. How dare you? But again, if I don't like the way the snapping's working, I can just turn that off once more. I will eyeball these numbers. I can always change it later. And at this point, your grid is finished. If you'd like, you can start designing a pattern or an image within the grid itself. But what I prefer to do, what I like to do, is save this image as a PNG with a transparent background. I save that somewhere on my computer, and then I can open a new canvas, a new document, import that grid, and I can design whatever then. That way, saving the original grid means I can use it over and over again. So at some point in the future, if I want to come back and make something else that is 20 by 20, I don't have to go through this whole process again. I can just reuse the grid that I've already made. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to save this grid that we've made. So just double check everything, make sure you've got the correct number of boxes, the correct number of rows, all your text is correct. So just give it a good look over and make sure everything is correct. Once those checks are complete and everything is all good, we're going to head up to File in the top left-hand corner here, click File, go down to Export, and then you can see we've got some options here. We're going to leave the width and height on 1080 by 1080. That was the canvas we set up originally. I tend to work with 300 DPI, so I'm just going to change the DPI here to 300. We're going to head down the bottom here. On the left-hand side, you can choose the folder where you'd like to save your grid. So you can choose, whatever folder on your hard drive or SSD. And then we want to make sure that we have portable network graphic selected. So if I click this arrow here, you have multiple file type options. We want PNG. That means our grid will have a transparent background. When we've done both of those, so you've selected the folder to export to, we have selected PNG. All we're going to do is press export. And that will export our grid for us. Now that grid we can use over and over again to create as many colorwork projects as we like. To check that it worked, that it exported correctly, we're going to navigate to whatever folder that you saved it to on your desktop. And here we go. I can double click on this. And there is my grid with the transparent background. So if I want to reuse this, I'm going to go back into Inkscape. If I want to reuse this, I'm going to go File, New from Template. So I will select when that loads. We're going to do what we did at the start. We're going to go to Social, which is the third one from the top. And I want to select where's 1080 by 1080. There you go. I'm going to open up the same size canvas that we used previously. Create from Template. And that will give me a new blank canvas to work with. I'm then just going to navigate back to that folder where I saved my grid. And I'm just going to click and drag that on to my new canvas. This will pop up. You can just press OK. You don't have to worry about that too much. And then we have it, the grid that we just made, imported into Inkscape. And if we navigate back to that folder where we exported it originally, the blank grid itself is still there. So we haven't touched that. That is there for future use. If I want to start designing something on the grid that I just dragged and dropped in, I will head back to my Layers and Objects panel over here. I will click on that. And you can see here, Image 1, that is my grid, so I can rename that if I like. I'm going to call that grid. I might even call that grid 20 by 20. So you can see that is one whole layer now. But leaving that highlighted, I'm then going to go across to the left-hand side and I want to find the bucket tool, which is down closer to the bottom here. And the shortcut for that is to press U on your keyboard. So you can see the little bucket cursor has come up. Then choose whatever color you want. So I'm going down the bottom here. I'm just going to select blue. And then we just need to click in individual squares to start designing our pattern. I don't know what I was going for there. I was just clicking on random boxes. And the good thing about this, you can see as I'm clicking, we're getting new layers over here in our Layers and Objects panel. So each click is a new layer. Now this can get really annoying because if we fill in all of these boxes, we're going to have a lot of layers over here. But like we did previously when we were creating the square, we can group these together. So all of these dark blue boxes, I can highlight all of those. I can Control G and I can call those dark blue. And then I'm going to select my grid again because I want to be working on the grid layer. And I'm going to change color. I want this cyan color and I'll need my bucket tool back. So I'm going to press U and then I can start plonking down some cyan colors. And once I'm done with that, I can highlight all of those together, Control and G, and I will call those cyan. So they're all grouped together. And if I want to delete one, I can click on the one I want to delete. I can either press delete on my keyboard or right click and where is delete? Right here, and delete, and that will delete that individual square. I can change the color if I don't like it. So if I highlight this square And let's say I want that to be green. I just make sure it's highlighted, I click on green, and that will change the color of that individual square. So doing it like this, it gives you quite a bit of freedom to alter and design the image that you want. You can really fine tune it. So just continue doing this, make the design that you want to make. And then once you're all finished, you've created your design, you've made something, beautiful like this, we're going to export it again. We're going to go to File up the top, Export, and this time instead of exporting it as a PNG with a transparent background, I mean, you can still do that, it's just you don't really need a transparent background at this point, but yeah, you can save it as a PNG if you want, but I usually save it as a JPEG. So we're just going to head on into the drop down menu, press the arrow, we're going to change the file type to JPEG, and then export. Again, just changing the folder you export it to if you would like to. All right, and export. So I've exported that, and then if I navigate back to that original folder, I should have my gorgeous design in there, and there you go. So that is one method you can use to, I'm going to keep that 20 by 20, but that is one method you can use to design your own squares. For being free, this is a really fantastic program, Inkscape. I do think it has a fairly steep learning curve, but there are honestly so many amazing tutorials available on YouTube. So if you'd like to learn to do anything else within Inkscape, I would highly recommend checking those tutorials out. Yeah, it's a really great program once you sort of get the gist of what everything does. That was a bit of a slog, wasn't it? But I hope you found it informative nonetheless. Usually at the end of my videos here, this is where I would have the hookup section, but I have decided against doing that in this case in particular, and possibly in the next video in this series as well, just because this tutorial has run so long. I think it's about an hour last I checked, and also it's hopefully informative, but also kind of bland. I didn't think it was fair to whoever the participant was to stick them in at the end of at least an hour-long video that is like kind of boring. Let's be honest, it's not the usual fun crochet challenge sort of stuff. So I have decided against doing a hookup for this video, and again possibly the next one, but they'll still be in my regular videos. I'm just not going to condemn some poor person to being at the end of this video, because if my YouTube analytics are anything to go by, not many people stick around to the very end of such a long video. So that is all we have to do today. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, found it informative. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those down in the comments and I will answer them as best as I can. Because this video runs so long, I will be splitting it up into multiple parts, so you can look forward to the Android version of this tutorial in a couple of weeks. And after that, I will go over, I think I mentioned I wanted to cover the topic of how to pixelate images and so on and so forth. So I would like to cover that at some point in the future as well. So if you're at all interested in that, consider subscribing if you haven't already. Like the video if you enjoyed it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and I will see you in the next video.